I think we can probably get started, and I'm going to call on Maggie Redekop to introduce our speaker today.
And what a pleasure that is. I'm just going to, his friends call him Raf, but Rafael with an F, not a PH, and with a diacritical mark over the E, is an aptly musical name for a man who is a translator and a poet, a man who works and plays with words lovingly and in a way that respects the history of each word in the many languages he reads and writes and speaks. Born in Toronto, Rafaël Newman is now an independent scholar living in Zurich, Switzerland. He earned a specialist BA in classics at U of T and an MA and PhD in comparative literature at Princeton. There he wrote a dissertation on Aristophanes and allegories of money in the subsequent comic tradition. His book, The Visible God, Staging the History of Money, was published in 1999. Since then, he has published widely on ancient and contemporary literature and culture in English, German, and French. His poetry has appeared in journals and collections, and he writes a monthly essay for an online journal called Three Quarks Daily, which I follow. Brilliant essays, every one of them, the most recent one on the idea and history of islands. Sometimes Raphael writes with his wife, Caroline Biedmer, a professor of comparative literature and cultural studies at Franklin University in Zurich. I think of him sort of as a Swiss version of Linda and Michael and Monique and Max. At Franklin University, Raphael occasionally teaches courses, such as, for example, Jewish writing in German-speaking countries and advanced creative writing. From the long list of his published articles, here are two titles to give you the flavor of his publications. The Schubert of Country Punk, Performance as Interpretation. Heine's Aristophanes, Compromise Formations and the Ambivalence of Carnival. What intrigues me especially about Rafaël Newman's writing is that he works so easily, or seems to, at a crossroads where most scholars don't even dare to go, the place where languages cross disciplines that seem far-flung from each other. Being fluent in so many languages must facilitate that, but in any case, interdisciplinarity seems to be inherent in all of his scholarly ventures. It is the main reason I suggested him as a speaker for Senior College, this place where all of us keep trying to communicate across our different disciplines. I believe that in some magical way, the disciplines are all at play when we make music together. So let me add one last detail, which is that Rafaël is a dramaturge for a group called Besuch der Lieder, an ensemble of singers and pianists that stages evenings of classical art song in people's homes in Switzerland and the bordering countries. He won't be singing for us today, but we are very lucky to have him here to speak to us about the work of art in the age of neural machine translation. So let's give a warm welcome to Rafaël Newman. All over to you, Raf.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Maggie. I used this term in an email exchange we had not long ago. It's a term that I learned from Dennis's daughter, Elaine. That was a four-wall that you gave me just now. You know the expression. I'm terribly flattered.
Can you explain that? Because I asked Dennis, what does that mean? And he didn't know. And Elaine was.
I'm not sure the actual origin of the image, but as I understood it, it meant overselling a product.
Okay.
Let's hope that you weren't overselling me. I'm terribly flattered and delighted by your wonderful words of welcome, and I'm especially grateful to you for inviting me, and to you, Linda, and to the rest of you for being here. What a wonderful venue, and I wish I could be there in person, but this is how the world is now. Right, the work of art in the age of neural machine translation. And indeed, when Maggie Redekop asked me last year to speak to you today about poetry and translation, which is a topic close to my heart for a number of reasons, I happened at the time to be working on a text concerned not with translating poetry, but with lyric expression in its most practical form. That is, as a commodity with a material history, as an object that can be traded, one with an exchange value as well as a use value, however the latter might be defined or experienced. The reason for this pragmatic frame of poetic mind was as follows. I had, for pecuniary purposes, been learning about fintech, or financial technology, about tokenized assets and distributed ledgers, and was thus briefly engaged by an ecosystem distant enough from my typical life experience that it had begun to present itself to me under the lurid aspect of science fiction, as a Peter Max and William S. Burroughs inspired lucid dream of teleporting aliens and iridescent currencies riding an ominous conveyor belt of ballot boxes. In other words, my day job was encroaching on my vocation. The pushback that I devised, a method for domesticating this unfamiliar terrain and rendering it at least temporarily welcome after hours in my psychological household, was to imagine a range of revered poets such as Sappho or John Donne, anachronistically encountering the strange new gods of Bitcoin, blockchain, and CBDC, central bank digital currency, and to ghostwrite the appropriate text for each of them. Here, for instance, for your amusement, is my ventriloquized Philip Larkin, a skeptic at a DeFi conference with a poem entitled Coins of Vantage. How bracing was the old imperial pound, the pence and shillings, each with their own base, the Latin sobriquets, which made them sound like an illicit substance. On each face, a profile pageantry of kings and queens, askance, ignored their treasure passed from hand to grubby hand, exchanged for magazines, for pints of bitter, and for goods less grand. Now, must we trade for hexadecimal this suitably eccentric currency? Skip metric for the boon infinitesimal of ciphered, scalable transparency? No thanks. I'd sooner fill my coffers with some gray and dismal continental gains, employ, though foreign, yet a coppersmith, than bind myself to blocks with virtual chains. And here is my Emily Dickinson, poring over her Ethereum account at midnight and awaiting with trepidation the chain's fork and its much trumpeted transition from proof of work to proof of stake. There is a ledger, manifold, unknown its frequency and whence. It chronicles a phantom gold alleged of its own genesis. I launched a covenant anent the filigree, those copies joins, and thus cannot be doubly spent, nor me corporeal, nor coins. But though contracted to myself, a codex kept in kindred seal safeguards my store of ghostly wealth, and but its shard our common weal. Well, I was so pleased with these efforts, thank you, Maggie, that I went on to imagine a newfangled poetry journal featuring videos of poets reading their own work, minted as NFTs or non-fungible tokens. You may know these digital artifacts as the images of a bored ape or penurious ex-president, and hosted on a blockchain. I wrote up the concept, and my white paper will appear later this year as a contribution to a new Swiss cultural studies journal devoted to trans-industriality. That's another story. So it was that when you, Maggie, approached me to talk about poetry and translation, and thanks again for that, I was of a mind to consider the typically immaterial art form as a physical object in circulation, in the process of being fundamentally transformed by the technology of its new medium. And thus it wasn't a great leap for me to consider the ancient craft of literary translation, think St. Jerome and his Lion, in a thoroughly contemporary form, rather than sub specie aeternitatis. In fact, my materialist perspective had been further prepared by a seminar recently offered at Zurich's Literaturhaus by Samuel Leubli, the young CTO of a local startup that had tailor-made software systems providing neural machine translation, or NMT, for our common corporate clients. NMT uses coordinates or parameters to map frequency and likelihood of collocations from one language to another. And it is distinguished from existing statistical translation engines like DeepL by its ability to learn from human users and to exploit such training in a transformative black box whose inner workings seem not entirely clear even to its constructors. Sam Leubli, whose dissertation at the University of Zurich was equal parts higher mathematics and Chinese linguistics, had cannily gathered a group of literary translators in order to allay our potential anxieties about these new robot overlords, and to encourage us to consider the possibilities afforded by the latest language technology. During the course of his presentation, Sam asked us to choose from blind samples of human and machine translated German versions of English prose texts, as it happens, in that direction, by contemporary authors like Ocean Vuong, for example. He then dealt compassionately and even-handedly with our professional amazement at the occasionally undetectable proficiency of the machine, and as well with our relieved Schadenfreude at its equally occasional parapraxes. Ha ha ha, we said to ourselves. Sam, he's a wonderful chap. Sam closed with what was, for me at least, his most reassuring, if provisional, conclusion, that the scope for using NMT, neural machine translation, to create allophone versions of poetry rather than prose was quite limited. Indeed, according to Sam, the only sensible lyrical application of AI at present was in creating versions of language games a la Oulipo, the 20th century French language school, such as lipograms or palindromes. Georges Perec and Raymond Queneau are the famous names there, a contention that I have seen borne out to my great, if pusillanimous, relief by the doggerel produced on command by ChatGPT occasionally, in the strong sense of that word, as in on the occasion of a birthday or retirement. Stuff is really crap. So for the moment, it seems, both poetical production and its translation are safely in human hands for the moment. Nevertheless, I remained on my guard, and with Maggie's prompt in mind, I sought advice for my discussion of an analog practice in an increasingly digitalized world in some champions of the old ways. The first, which gave me my title, and I will admit it was chosen in part for its shock or recognition value, is of course Walter Benjamin's 1935 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And his proposal, Benjamin's proposal, that artistic production is transformed as a practice when the parameters used to assess it are fundamentally altered. But the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, Benjamin writes in Harry Zone's translation, I should add, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, namely politics. So I wondered, could Benjamin's formulation be applied to the latest developments in artificial intelligence, as it is used to create texts both everyday and paraliterary, thus challenging the authenticity of literary creation, its ritual aura, its individual genius, and what indeed might be the politics of such a move? At another recent event at the Literaturhaus, the author and AI expert Patrick Karpachenko raised the specter of what he called good enough writing, troubling, a specter troubling to those who earn their living with the craft. Good enough writing, said Carpi, is that species of text produced by AI that does not perhaps bear the idiosyncratic hallmarks of human creativity, but is at least fit for purpose, and thus gives rise to a reversal of the old warning that the perfect is the enemy of the good. In this case, the good enough is the enemy of the perfect. But maybe we're done with authenticity anyway, with the genuine work of art, with individual genius, with the aura. Benjamin himself, after all, seems to have been over it as soon as he enunciated the idea. For we have, of course, seen an exponential increase in the pace of reproduction since the interwar period, Benjamin's period. Ours is a veritable age of echoes, of doppelgangers, of recreation, of challenges to authenticity. And all of these gestures were always already the hallmarks of the work of translation, and specifically the work of translating poetry. For if, as Robert Frost suggested, poetry is what is lost in translation, then translators of poetry are on a fool's errand at best. And if Coleridge was right in his assessment that poetry is the best words in the best order, then its translators are not only traitors, they are also grave robbers, iconoclasts, and vandals. Now, just to give this mini Chrestomathy, this Poetry Is volume from Reader's Digest, a little balance, I note that the poet Chaim Nachman Bialik said that translation is like kissing through a handkerchief. Well, in a recent review of a novel by Jennifer Croft, herself a translator, the author remarks that translation is always a threesome. The primal scene viewed from the perspective of the parents, frustrated in flagrante by the interposition of an epigony interpreter. So translation is at least sexy, if also a criminal enterprise. Now, perhaps, to borrow Linda Hutchins' formulation, it would be more useful to call poetry and translation an adaptation. That is, repetition, but not replication, thus forsaking neither its Benjaminian aura nor the pre-political comfort of ritual. Further, and continuing with the same theoretical model, we could stress both the processual and the productive aspects of the term translation, as Linda Hutchins does with the term adaptation. Its diachronic place in a long and continuous tradition, or as one element in a necessary chain of at least two texts, and its synchronic existence at a given moment under particular historical conditions. This is what I propose to do today. To give you a sense of my own practice or process when I translate poetry, and to present some finished examples of my production that might more properly be termed adaptations, due to their migration not only between linguistic idioms, but also across generic and cultural borders. But before I do, let me offer you a more sanguine illumination of my trade than that afforded by Frost, Coleridge, or Bialik, one that constitutes a metatextual staging of the creative act that is translation, one that is, as it were, a degree zero of translation, and which is, furthermore, only available in the translated version of its particular ur-text, and thus enjoys a double guarantee of authenticity, I would suggest, if we had not already placed that term under erasure. In her 2018 version of Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, Olga Tokarczuk's 2009 Eco-Vegan Whodunit, Antonia Lloyd-Jones, one of the Polish Nobel laureate's two sterling English translators, the other is Jennifer Croft, as it happens, Antonia Lloyd-Jones heroically resolves what must have seemed at first glance an intractable problem. Perhaps some of you have read the novel. It's wonderful. I highly, highly recommend it. The narrator of Tokarczuk's novel, Janina, an elderly literary translator living in the Polish countryside, is engaged in a project with her friend and colleague, Dizzy. The two are preparing Polish versions of the poetry of William Blake. In the scene in question, Janina and Dizzy have just begun their tandem work on The Mental Traveler, a poem unpublished during Blake's lifetime and collected in the Pickering manuscript. Tokarczuk writes, in Lloyd Jones's English rendering, right at the start, that is, in the poem's title, The Mental Traveler, a dispute arose between Blake's two Polish interpreters, Janina and Dizzy, over whether we should translate the English word mental as mentalne, mental in the literal sense, meaning of the mind, or duchowe, more like spiritual. So far, so good. Lloyd Jones has faithfully conveyed a fairly standard point of philology, one furthermore that English scholars of Blake will themselves have wrestled with in their reading of the unadulterated text, given the poet's penchant for idiosyncratic usage. Think of mental fight in his celebrated Jerusalem. At any rate, The Mental Traveler begins, and here I'm going to share the screen and show you these texts because they're best followed in real time. Can everybody see that? I'm going to do it like this. You might have to move the boxes around. You should see now 5 boxes with 5 texts. Here's how The Mental Traveler begins in Blake's text, let's call it. I traveled through a land of men and women too, and heard and saw such dreadful things as cold earth wanderers never knew. And the two fellow translators begin side by side, and you can see as we go across the top. First, we each wrote out our own translation in the trochaic meter, more natural to Polish verse. Then we compared them and started to wind our ideas together. It was a bit like a game of logic, a complicated form of Scrabble. Now, this is not a bad description of one of the chief, if secret, pleasures of the work of literary translation in general, as evinced recently by my friend Ulrich Blumenbach, the eminent German translator of English literature, who's currently at work on a version of Finnegan's Wake, and who is frequently asked to explain why he would inflict such a task on himself, because it's fun. And then Lloyd Jones goes on, admirably and incredibly, to render Tokarczuk's fictional, or rather actual, Polish translations of Blake's English poetry back into English 3 times, and then later a final 4th. And here they are. Over human lands I wander. This is Polish now. You have to imagine this is written in Polish. Over human lands I wandered, lands of men and also women, seeing, hearing things so fearful, such as no mind ever summoned. Or, through the world of men I journeyed, realms of men as well as women, hearing, seeing sights so awful, no pure soul would ever dream on. Or, throughout the world of men I wandered, crossing realms of men and women. What I saw and heard was ghastly, such as none would ever dream on. The two colleagues then discussed their versions, bringing to bear perspectives both political and prosodic, with which Tokarczuk's habitual readers will have become familiar. Why have we insisted on putting the word women at the end? Janina asks. What if we made it men's and women's land? Then the rhyme would be with land, hand, or stand, for instance. This is a representation of Polish, remember. And here, of course, Lloyd Jones has had to concoct alternative English rhymes to convey the Polish non-cognates. The text continues, Dizzy, her friend, said nothing, chewed his fingers, and at last triumphantly suggested, and that's the last box here, as I wandered human countries, men's and women's shared domain, dreadful things did I encounter, horrors none on earth had seen. You see, he still puts women second, but she decided to give up that fight. I didn't like the word domain, notes Janina, but now we were up and running, and by 10 o'clock, the whole poem was done. What Lloyd Jones, Antonia Lloyd Jones, one of those two excellent translators of Olga Tokarczuk, what she enacts here effectively in a hypertrophied Borgesian rewriting, or rather making strange, of the English refracted through the Polish and back into English, is an experimental proof of Proust's contention that all writing is translation. Indeed, in a Derridian gesture of reversal, she gives us translation as prior to writing. So bully to us translators. And with that, I come at last to some samples of my own work as a translator of poetry. Now, although I cannot claim to have overturned the hierarchy of writing and translation in my own practice, it is true that I first tried my hand at English versions of foreign verse not long after I had begun, with typically pubescent self-importance, staking my claim on lyric posterity. One of my earliest attempts was a translation of a poem by Catullus, a poem I had read in a first-year seminar with Kenneth Quinn at the University of Toronto, and which I have preserved and embellished since. My version takes extraordinary liberties with the Romans, liberties mainly of the formal variety. Since I have transposed Catullus's characteristic hendecasyllabic meter, unrhymed, as was the normal case with Latin verse until the medieval period, into the Renaissance straitjacket of an Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. Not entirely an alienation, given Petrarch's admiration of his Roman Republican forebear. But the chief fun for me comes in an entirely paratextual element in the punning title I've given to Catullus's otherwise merely numbered poem. And here it is. Catullus 13, Cenabis bene me fabul apud me. It's a response, it's an invitation to dine. I won't tire you with the Latin. Here's my translation, more sense than money. You'll understand why that's so hilariously funny when I read you the poem. You will dine well with me, fabulous friend, God's smiling on you in a few short days, provided, large and sumptuous, you raise a meal, to which a lovely maid append, and wine and wit, and all your laughter lend. These things and others like our friend in grace you'll need to bring, and here's the cause apace. Your poet does his purse with cobwebs, and it's a bit of a stretch. But in return, you will receive pure love, or rather, what's more elegant and sweet. For I shall give you perfume, which did those almighties grant my girl from up above, which when you smell it, you'll those same entreat to make of you, Fabullus, one great nose. More sense than money. The poet doesn't have enough money to offer actual food. He has to have his guests bring it potluck style, but he can give them a delicious perfume. And there is very likely some fairly raunchy subtext going on there, but it wasn't entirely available to me at age 17, I guess. And that's also the reason for some of the pretty awkward, twisted formulations for the sake of the rhyme with cobwebs mend and the cause apace and lovely maid append. But it was an early attempt. Fine, that was Catullus. I moved on then, eventually, as one does, from the frivolous and often randy Catullus to his younger contemporary Horace, whose career coincided with the rise of the Roman Empire and who produced, among other things, some joyful but high-minded expressions of Epicurean philosophy in verse form. Since I have remained less high-minded myself, however, and although I was at the time already older than Horace was at the time of his death, though not spiritually much past puberty, the poem of his that I chose to adapt was one of his amatory odes, or rather his famously ironic prayer of thanks for the fortuitous release from a love affair with an unsuitable partner. Again, the fun for me comes with my sassy title, which plays on a stock classical expression as well as on the name of Horace's ex-girlfriend. More than that, however, it is now less a formal change that I've rung than a generic, since my version, which you'll see in a moment, which has appeared in Ezra, a serious online journal of poetry and translation, was in fact originally intended to serve as the lyrics to a song, in the neo-disco idiom specifically, an ongoing project with a musician colleague, on which more in a moment. And here's Horace, Book 1, Poem 5, Quis multa gracilis te puer in rosa perfusus liquidis urget odoribus grato pira subantro, translated by none less than John Milton. What slender youth bedewed with liquid odors courts thee on roses in some pleasant cave? Pyrrha, for whom bound'st thou in wreaths thy golden hair, plain in thy neatness? Oh, how oft shall he on faith and changed gods complain, and seas rough with black winds and storms unwonted shall admire? Who now enjoys thee credulous, all gold, who always vacant, always amiable, hopes thee, of flattering gales unmindful. Hapless they to whom thou untried seemst fair. Me in my vowed picture the sacred wall declares to have hung my dank and dropping weeds to the stern god of sea. And here's me, a few centuries later, writing a Pyrrhic defeat, ha ha ha. He's lost out in love, but he's better off without this young woman whose name is Pyrrha. Who's loving you now, hot pants? Because of course Pyrrha means the fiery one in Greek. Who's loving you now, hot pants? What slender hip boy drenched in aftershave is making googly eyes outside the latest club? Who'd you do your golden hair up for tonight in that meticulously artless quiff? Damn, but he'll be cursing your faith and gasping goggle-eyed as black winds whip the ocean wave engendered by a fickle deity. He who now weighs your worth in bullion, who thinks you'll always be available, always in the mood, all ignorant of the fool's gold under his hands. The more fools they who'll fall for anything that glitters. As for myself, I've hung my dripping glad rags up to dry as an offering to the mighty god of storms and in sacred token of my thanks. If you can imagine that with a sort of ABBA-like disco beat behind it, that's what we were trying for. And as to that colleague, my work, this is where I hope this talk takes a little twist. My work as a translator of poetry has been importantly influenced by collaboration with musicians in both pragmatic professional terms and in matters of technique and theory. And apropos second puberty, during the first decade of the present millennium, I served as lyrics writer and chief vocalist for the Newman, a country punk outfit based in Zurich and comprising a rockabilly-inspired lead guitarist from Basel, a thrash punk enthusiast bass player from Bern, a Dutch drummer with a passion for prog rock, and a reggae-loving rhythm guitarist. It goes without saying that we broke up following the release of our second album due to artistic differences. It's a great tradition. Driven as much by a mischievous eclecticism as by the sheer need for sources, I adapted as lyrics for our 2-minute tunes and more soulful, though no less raunchy ballads, texts such as June, a socially critical text by Shi Tao, the imprisoned Tiananmen Square dissident, whose elegy of lost innocence, both amatory and political, reminded me of Neil Young's Ohio, and Gute Nacht by Wilhelm Müller, the first in the Winterreise series famously set to music by Franz Schubert. And I will return to the latter soon, towards the end of my talk. First, however, I want to say a word about a more recent, and Maggie mentioned this, I'm very glad you set this up, about a more recent and still ongoing musical collaboration, one in which my poetic translation plays a central and explicit role. Since 2015, I have been a member of an association known as Besuch der Lieder, as Maggie mentioned, or Singing Visit, the Visit of Songs, which is a play on the title of Heinrich Heine's first collection of poems, Buch der Lieder, or Book of Songs, published in 1827. Heine is, of course, among other things, the Jewish-born author of verses so well known and loved that not even the Nazis were entirely capable of expunging them all from the German canon. And his renown comes in large measure from the fact that eminent composers of the Romantic period, among them Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann, set his poems to some of the most beautiful music of the period, indeed of any period. Songs which were then performed during the 19th century at private gatherings in the homes and at the salons of German and Austrian society. True to its name then, our association, Besuch der Lieder, seeks to recreate this phenomenon by staging private house concerts throughout Switzerland and in the countries it borders, typically featuring piano and 1 or 2, occasionally 3 singers, performing programs of Lieder, chansons, or canzone, assembled from the classical repertoire, Schubert and Schumann, of course, but also Saint-Saëns, Strauss, and Ravel, among others. My role in the association is that of, Maggie mentioned this as well, is that of dramaturge. It's a slightly idiosyncratic use of that term here, or impresario, let's say, guiding the small audiences of hand-picked guests through our thematically linked suggestions or selections, commenting not on the music, but on the poetic texts chosen for the various settings. And in this capacity, I often find myself translating those texts, not into English, since our audiences are usually Germanophone, on occasion Francophone, or more rarely Italophone, but typically from French or English into German, a direction that cannot concern us here today. In my work as a publicist for the association, however, I have found myself preparing translations in the opposite direction, from German into English. And on one such occasion, in fact, I was moved to create two versions of the text for one of Schubert's most beloved, most celebrated, most programmatic songs, An die Musik, Deutsch number 547, one archaic, the other modern, to demonstrate our capacity as an association for bridging the affective divide of two centuries. And here's An die Musik by Franz von Schober, Du holde Kunst in wie viel grauen Stunden, wo mich des Lebens wilder Kreis umstreckt. It's an ode to music. And here are my two translations, one archaizing, as I say, and one modern. Full often hast thou gracious art, when savage life had caught me in its net, a love within me stirred to warm my heart and salvaged me from this world to a better yet, from this world to a better yet. The echo is an imitation of Schubert's repetition of Franz von Schober's line. Oft hath a sweet and sacred chord of thine array a sigh escaped from out thy harp to me, and bared a heaven of hope for better days. Thou gracious art, for this my thanks to thee. Thou gracious art, my thanks to thee. Du holde Kunst, ich danke dir dafür. And here's the modernizing translation, prepared, in fact, when there was a protest at my archaizing translation. How many times have I been low, caught in a day's embrace, and you were there to comfort me, to warm my heart and transport me off to a better place? How often has a song of yours, a sigh, a sound rung out? Sweet music, how you made me see a better world awaited me. My thanks to you for that. The question here, of course, being, is it appropriate to render 19th century diction in German, which will have been the normal diction for a lyric poem at the time, into an archaizing diction in English, or to transpose it into a modern pop sensibility? In this same adaptive vein, I am currently at work on a new offering for Besuch der Lieder, which has to date, for obvious reasons, focused on German language evenings. I am preparing a program specifically intended for an audience of Anglophones, of which there are surprisingly many among the expats of Zurich and Geneva. My concept is that we will perform Schumann's Dichterliebe cycle, A Poet's Love, his setting of a series of texts from Heine's Buch der Lieder, in German, interrupted or punctuated by my own performance, cabaret style, of my own new English translations, adaptations of the poems in a variety of styles, archaicizing or modernized. Here's a sample of the latter sort. And this is Heine's poem, Ich grolle nicht. Ich grolle nicht, and here it is in a standard translation by a certain Richard Stokes. I bear no grudge. I bear no grudge, though my heart is breaking. O love forever lost, I bear no grudge. However you gleam in diamond splendor, no ray falls in the night of your heart. I've known that long, for I saw you in my dreams and saw the night within your heart and saw the serpent gnawing at your heart. I saw, my love, how pitiful you are. I bear no grudge. Here's my cabaret style modernized version. Me hold a grudge. Me hold a grudge. Not even brokenhearted. There's no hard feelings, though we've truly parted. No matter how you preen and strut your stuff and sport your flashes threads, your heart is dark enough. I've got you pegged. Me hold a grudge, not even brokenhearted. I saw you in a dream, you know, and saw the night that fills your soul and saw the snake that feasts upon your heart. I saw, my love, how miserable you are. Me hold a grudge. So what I've done, of course, is amplified Heine's characteristic high irony into a kind of bitchy diction that seemed to me to suit the mentality of the poem. And we'll see whether it works in performance. As my final example, allow me to return to that earlier phase of my poetico-musical collaborations, to my work with the Newman and to my adaptation of the song from the Winterreise to which I have referred, and which offered an unwitting foretaste of this current project and a bridge to my current late phase of creation. Schubert's 1828 cycle, Winterreise, was the setting of poems by the recently deceased author Wilhelm Müller. The 24 texts of Müller's cycle, Die Winterreise, he called it. Schubert cut out the article and called it just Winterreise. Müller's cycle render an impressionistic account of a solo voyage made during the winter months by a first-person narrator, away from a life of social connection and towards an uncertain, solitary, death-tinged destination. The writer of the poems, Müller, and the composer of the songs, Schubert, were both young men at the time of creation, both biologically and politically speaking. Young in years, as well as in the Oedipal sense of rebels against the old order, the restoration reactionism of the post-Napoleonic Biedermeier period, in which politics had been put on ice, and anything vaguely critical of the restored regime had to be expressed allegorically. And here I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and then once again share. Let's see how I do this, because I want to play something for you. See whether I can manage this. Share sound. Here. See whether this works. This is the great Fischer Dieskau. Tell me whether you can hear this. Singing Gute Nacht, the first song in the cycle. Good Night, a strange title for the first song in a cycle. It's sublime, and it goes on in this vein, as you can see, for about another 3 minutes, and I would gladly allow it to play. Alfred Brendel and Dieskau, Fischer Dieskau. Let me cut it off just there for reason of time. Some of you may well know, the singer goes on to lament his isolation and the fact that he's had to flee the town and the love that he had once known. Dogs chase him. He's seeking wild animals that he could perhaps follow or maybe kill and eat. He's decided that people are fickle, love doesn't last. But then he softens towards the end and realizes that he may be disturbing the sleep of his loved one. He's become sort of dissociated, and resolves to send her a last message. She should know that as he walked past her gate on his way out into the cold wilds, he thought of her and left her a message in his mind, or perhaps on the gate. This is the song that I used. This is the text that I used. And by this time, I was influenced as much by the music and the sentiment as by the poetic text that I used as a basis for a song that we created for our first album. And I'd like to play you some of that. And it's a little bit from the sublime to ridiculous, but have some forbearance with me. This is our country punk version of Gute Nacht by Schubert with my lyrics, which I'll put up on the screen in a moment. But listen to this.
Stranger when I got here, and I ain't met nobody yet. Just like spring showers, they bring me flowers. This here pilgrim sails are set. Mr. Right, but that's all long ago. The world has lost its glow, and there'll be blood on the snow tonight. Blood on the snow tonight. Blood on the snow tonight. Goodbye, angel. Goodbye, stranger. There'll be blood on the snow tonight.
Thank you for allowing me to play that for you. It was really a bit of a dream come true to be able to play that music for people back in my hometown. I'm just looking for my texts again. What have I done with them? There they are. I want to show you now. Sorry. No, I've got it. Share screen. The text. There we are. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Good. This printed very small so you can see them together. What is immediately salient in my version of the German text is that it plays fast and loose with perhaps hackneyed jokes and country bumpkin idioms in a way that is foreign to Miller's plain speech, while at the same time pushing the suicidal imagery of the German text rather farther in the direction of the literal. There will be blood on the snow tonight, after all, promises an act of violence that is all the realer for its harnessing as a figure for writing. It's so dark, the moon's a shadow, I wrote, and it's my one and only light. There ain't no map can say where I done went astray, but there'll be blood on the snow tonight. Dream on, darling, don't let me stir you. I wouldn't want to bring you down. but I'm already bound for the stony ground on the midnight side of town. In the morning when you waken and look out on fields of white, read the elegy that you wrote for me. There'll be blood on the snow tonight. The music we developed as a setting for the text, meanwhile, substitutes rising vocal energy and melodic dynamics for Schubert's ironic, counterintuitive shift towards his song's close from minor to major. Blood on the Snow Tonight also mimics the plodding rhythm of Gute Nacht, its walking rhythm, with a stumbling percussion break, which was regularly the source of hilarity in rehearsal when our drummer would attempt to change it up with a less awkward variation. The combined effect of these musico-structural gestures, then, was to give our song an air of defiance in the face of despair, one shared with the yodeling blues of the prolific Hank Williams, whom I am pleased to refer to anachronistically as the Schubert of country music. That's taken from one of the texts that Maggie cited. Of course, these interpretations, both textual and especially musical, were not wholly deliberate, but grew in large part out of the collaborative effort of jamming with my fellow bandmates in a Swiss bomb shelter. My bandmates and I were moved at the time by our double indebtedness to both country and punk idioms, to Johnny Cash and The Clash, if you like, to a ferment of folk conservatism and urban anarchism that proved extraordinarily fertile. And it is largely in retrospect that I have become conscious of the degree to which we were reproducing what may very well have been the experience of a yet more ancient lyric tradition, or at least of that oppressive period in which Schubert lived. Biedermeier was in some ways the mirror image of our own age, in which every utterance is explicitly suffused with politics. In other ways, of course, we are currently witnessing a distressing form of restoration, a revanchist backlash on the part of a series of Ancien Regime, reports of whose death seem to have been greatly exaggerated. But there has been some recent good news thanks to the Turkish municipal elections, just as a side note. So now, let me now, in conclusion and as promised, return to the political dimension of poetry and thus of its translation or adaptation. In The Prevention of Literature, an article published in 1946 in the journal Polemic, George Orwell writes about the relative neglect of verse by totalitarian regimes, which tend to focus, he says, on the perceived threat posed by writers of prose. His tacit suggestion is that poetry accommodates itself politically to fascism. There is no such thing as genuinely non-political literature, Orwell writes, and least of all in an age like our own, when fears, hatreds, and loyalties of a directly political kind are near to the surface of everyone's consciousness. Sounds familiar. Even a single taboo can have an all-round crippling effect upon the mind, because there is always the danger that any thought which is freely followed up may lead to the forbidden thought. It follows that the atmosphere of totalitarianism is deadly to any kind of prose writer, though a poet, says Orwell, at any rate a lyric poet, might possibly find it breathable. And Orwell goes on, it is not certain whether the effects of totalitarianism upon verse need be so deadly as its effects on prose. There's a whole series of converging reasons why it is somewhat easier for a poet than for a prose writer to feel at home in an authoritarian society. To begin with, bureaucrats and other practical men usually despise the poet too deeply to be much interested in what he is saying. Secondly, what the poet is saying, this is Orwell now, what the poet is saying, that is what his poem means, if translated into prose, is relatively unimportant even to himself. End of citation. Here, Orwell is clearly thinking more of Virgil, pressed into service by Caesar Augustus as the glorifier of his imperial project, rather than of a contemporary of his own like W.H. Auden, a deeply political poet, the meaning of whose work was of profound importance to himself and to his like-minded readers. And by the way, as I learned reading the Aeneid years ago with the late Father Owen Lee, Even Virgil managed to smuggle in a certain ambivalence about the Roman enterprise into his etiological pageant of the founding of the Eternal City. Side note. At very least, Orwell here is displaying his own contempt for what he may in 1946 have still viewed as the bourgeois formalism of poetry. Because, of course, there are indeed poets who have not accommodated themselves to totalitarian regimes and who have paid a high price for their intransigence. The jury is still out, I suppose, on Bertolt Brecht. But what of Mahmoud Darwish and Elsa Lasker-Schuler, variously attacked and repressed for their commitment in verse to a cause or a people or a language? And what of Federico Garcia Lorca, murdered shortly after the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War? In a recent essay in Paris Review, Zain Khalid writes about Garcia Lorca's time at Columbia University in 1929 and about the resulting posthumously published volume, Poet in New York, in which the Spanish poet expresses his solidarity with a range of the city's dispossessed and excoriates its savagery and corruption at the dawn of the Great Depression. About Garcia Lorca's death in 1936 at the hands of nationalists, Khalid says, though the exact circumstances surrounding Garcia Lorca's execution remain unknown, it was a civil war. The nationalists wanted to return to the monarchy, and he, Garcia Lorca, was a gay socialist. These things tend to happen. Well, in fact, it may even have been the case that Garcia Lorca was murdered despite his by then celebrated verse, rather than because of it. The reasons for his targeting remain lost along with his remains. What is certain, and of particular interest to us here today, is the way that Garcia Lorca's legacy has been preserved in part through his translation, or rather through his adaptation in song. Leonard Cohen often remarked on the role that the Spanish poet played in his own growth as an artist. In his speech of thanks for the Prince Asturias Award in 2011, Cohen said, "Now you know of my deep association and confraternity with the poet Federico Garcia Lorca. I could say that when I was a young man, an adolescent, and I hungered for a voice, I studied the English poets and I knew their work well, and I copied their styles, but I could not find a voice. It was only when I read, even in translation, the works of Lorca that I understood that there was a voice. It is not that I copied his voice. I would not dare. But he gave me permission to find a voice, to locate a voice. That is, to locate a self that is not fixed, a self that struggles for its own existence." Tellingly, Cohen speaks here of copying the styles of the English poets he studied, but of refraining from copying his Spanish idol. Instead, he says Garcia Lorca gave him a voice, even a self, and a political self at that, one that is unfixed and in struggle. Recall the trial of the poet Cohen stages in his 1974 song, "A Singer Must Die," and all the ladies go moist, and the judge has no choice. A singer must die for the lie in his voice. Accordingly, when Cohen explicitly uses a poem by Garcia Lorca as the material for one of his songs, Cohen's "Take This Waltz" is based on Garcia Lorca's Pequeño Vals Vienés, or Little Viennese Waltz, published posthumously in the Poeta in Nueva York volume. The Canadian singer does quite literally take the Spanish poet's waltz and run with it to produce a version that is in the very strongest sense an adaptation rather than a translation of the poem. Since the latter, as we know, translation of poetry, although it may well be quite sexy, is in fact a crime. Thank you.